The next thing that we do, and this one's pretty intense because this is an example of a plan for a teacher that's in a self-contained environment. Right? In a self-contained environment, they're typically implementing a point system, right? Do you guys, like the points in a level system? So what we do is we basically automate that for them. They keep track of the information on paper or on a mobile device, and then the information's uploaded into the system. And then it keeps track of what level the kid's at, how many points they've earned, their rates of progress. And all this, what we know is because every district does it differently, you have to configure your processes to match the district's process. So we don't want to come in with just one system or size fits all. It's got to be braided. What this tells us a little bit is that this student earned his full points, able to provide on-task response for every period except 4th period and 7th period. Do you see that? Does that make sense? So we're just taking that point sheet and we're putting it in the system basically. We're evaluating how the strategies, we're looking at how often the problem behaviors occur. And then what we do is we can generate different types of reports. And one of the reports that we can look at is some sort of daily report card. Remember the teacher talking, or the parent talking about how she knew how the kid did before he got home? It's because they email this to the parents a lot of times. So having a procedure, one of the things I think we do, we actually do a pretty good job of in schools is collecting information. But what we don't always do as good of a job about is sharing that information with other stakeholders. So teachers collect a lot of information, but do they get it back in a usable format that makes sense to them? And I don't think they do a lot. And I think that's one of the reasons why teachers feel the way they do about data, because they don't see how it impacts them on a day-to-day basis. So having a process where the information you're collecting is shared back with the teachers and the parents is obviously important. We also know that kind of sends a message that we're monitoring the implementation in some way. And we know that one of the number one ways to improve implementation of any initiative is to monitor the implementation. So this is data that gets generated about a day. The teachers tend to like this because it keeps track of all the level stuff for them, keeps track of how the kids are doing. And then, it wouldn't be a behavioral system without charts, right? So we chart all different types of things. We can break things down by period, by behavior, by strategy, things like that. And then we also have an improvement analysis report that we use, right? So we'll plug in the dates of how we want to look at the outcomes of the kids' behavior over time. A lot of districts will use this for extended school year services to evaluate the need for ESY services. Because you could put in 3 date ranges and have the percent of time the kid's meeting his goal before the break, after the break, and then the recoupment period. So that's another way that we use the data. And then there's a summary report. And the summary report, in the example that the parent was talking about, this is something that would be shared with the parent typically every 3 weeks. So something like this would be shared with the parent along with the charts. And this tells us the percent of time the kid's meeting his goals for the different objectives. It tells us how often the problem behaviors are occurring. It tells us on average how much time they're spending in general education settings. It tells us overall the percent of time the kid's meeting goals for the plan. So it's really kind of evaluating the plan. Does this make sense to you guys? So for special education, this tends to be the data that's most helpful. We've used this in due process hearings for districts, other types of legal situations. I think that parents of kids with special needs sometimes don't always understand what goes on in special ed programs and special ed classes. And their fear, frankly, is that nothing's going on. So sharing them with the information, I think, is really critical as a way to kind of win them over. So collecting the right type of data for the right tier of services we think is critical, and then having a process of how we share that information with different people is just as important. There is an incident reporting component of the system, and that was something that they were talking about with Brandon, something that they would evaluate. We track all different types of incidents. This is probably the thing that's most similar to Swiss that you were talking about earlier. It's completely configurable for districts. But we can look at office referrals, the use of restraints, health incidents, So that's different type of data that we'll collect. Again, at a Tier 1 implementation, not of the level system I showed you, but at a Tier 1 implementation, the office referral data can be very helpful. It's more supplemental data at the later tiers. The behavioral report card tends to be the most important data to collect at those later tiers. Email alerts also go out if there's an incident reported. The behavioral support, one thing I'd like to talk a little bit about for this was if a student, what they did, one of the districts we were working with, what they did was they were promoting inclusion through the district. A lot of concern that from the principals that you're really just dumping these kids back for me and you're not really going to support them in any way. So those self-contained classrooms became more of a behavioral support process. So if a kid started having problems in the class, they could go there, de-escalate, and then return back to the classroom. So we started evaluating how frequently they were using those types of systems into schools, and then how that impacted office referrals. And you saw a 35% reduction in the use of office referrals by having a behavioral support process in a school somewhere. And it makes sense. You know, if you send a kid to the office, there's very limited tools in that toolbox. And suspensions and detentions and tend to be the ones that get pulled out the quickest. So if we could de-escalate the kids quickly, serve them well, that tends to be effective. This is just kind of a summary of incidents that have happened. The next thing we wanted to do, so what we've done here is kind of at 3 levels, right? The first thing we wanted to do was to try to create a process where we can collect the behavioral data we need. And you have to pay a lot of attention to how much information you're collecting. One of the most common stumbling blocks that we see in implementation is that when districts get real excited about the idea of supporting these initiatives, and you get people who have been saying, we need to collect data, they finally get the green light to collect data, and then the collection of the data becomes too comprehensive and too overwhelming, and so no one does it. And you don't get the data you need. So it really tends to torpedo those types of initiatives. So looking at the existing data you have is important, and then minimizing, not in a minimal way is probably not the right word, but getting the right size data requirements for the tier services is the second point. And then how we share that information with the stakeholders is the third component of it and is most important. The other thing that we want to share with districts is why to put these initiatives in place to begin with. And this tends to be for the superintendent, the school board, and it's also part of our research that we do. I still have connections with the University of Houston and do research with some of my colleagues and from the university and some of the doctoral students that are still there. Well, not as many of them are there now, but still work with some doctoral students in the program. So one of the things we wanted to look at was, if you see improvement in behavioral progress, do you see subsequent gains academically? And we wanted to really look at 2 measures of academic outcome. One was a standardized test like the Stanford Achievement Test. And then we also wanted to look at a state assessment. So passing rates on the state assessment. In Texas, that's the TAKS. Let me tell you a little bit about this study. This was a study that we collected this data. This is students in the ED program. And we collected data in 08 and 09. And we had academic data. We ended up with about 300 students or so. There's 2 different studies, 258 actually to be exact in this study. You know, getting the state assessment data for the students in special ed behavior, there's not as much of that data, so we had our sample size shrinked a little bit. But of that group, emotionally disturbed is the primary handicapping condition for 64%, followed by specific learning disabilities, other health impaired was common. Of the students, 30% attended elementary school, 53 were in middle school, and 17% were in high schools. And then the ethnic breakdown of the students is up there as well. You can see it's a 64% African American sample, 30% Hispanic, 6% white or Caucasian, and predominantly economically disadvantaged sample. So, you know, this is kind of a prototypical large urban school district with some of the challenges around serving these kids.